I never imagined a life could pivot on something no bigger than my gloved hand. It was the kind of January night that eats your breath. Wind had come down off the bitter roots like an answer to a prayer nobody intended to make, white and sharp, turning the world into hard-edged silence. The AM in my Chevy C10 spilled static in a country tune I couldn't place. The CB squawked an anxious man I'll never know. My thermos of coffee went cold against the cab as I sat there, knuckles white on the wheel, watching the road disappear into a wall of falling snow. I was doing a run for the radio shop in Hamilton. Old transmitter needed a new tube, and the shortcut over Stanton Creek had me in a whiteout by the time I realized I'd seen something move. At first I thought it was a rabbit, then a dog, then nothing at all. The highway seemed to be swallowing the shapes. I slowed, then stopped, because sometimes your muscle memory knows better than your eyes. You learn to pay attention out here. Animals get in trouble when you don't. There, half under the drift and tucked against the embankment, was a shape that didn't belong. It wasn't quite right for anything I'd seen. Hair, yes, but a face that looked small and wet and too human to be off the shoulder of a deer. It breathed like a child. It shivered in the wind like a match. I had gloves thick enough to handle a radiator hose, a flashlight that spat out a cone of yellow, and a brain that, in that split second, chose not to catalog species. It chose the only simple thing left: something alive needs help. By the time I got it into the truck, my fingers were numb through the wool. It weighed less than a sack of feed, curled up like a frightened mason. One eye flicked open and came to rest on me in a way that said, without words, "Please." The vet in Hamilton closed an hour ago. The ambulance was for humans, not whatever I was holding. So I drove the 10 miles back to the cabin with the heater on full and the heater vent bringing a smell of oil and wet wool. The creature tucked itself against the heat duct, held onto my jacket with a paw that had fingertips but too much hair. It didn't cry. It made a low sound, like a throat clearing, and I felt the catch in my chest. Some part of my life I've never been able to name leaned forward. When I reached the cabin, the wood stove welcomed us like a sun. The stove glass was fogged with the breath of the house, the braided rag rug in front of it stiff with last night's frost. I put the creature on an old wool blanket and stripped my gloves. The animal, call it child, none of the labels fit, was smaller than my forearm. Its head covered in wet, dark hair, hands petite and clever. Its face could have been a distorted toddler, except for the heavy brows and the deep, slow blink that seemed older than its size. You can live with the odd in the backcountry. You get used to coyotes that seem to watch you, elk vultures that sit on fence posts like weather vanes.
But this didn't belong to any ledger I kept. It didn't matter. I did what I do. I warmed it, I fed it, I made it a place by the stove. I wrapped it in a flannel I'd kept from my father, put a coffee can of warm water, careful, not too hot, against its belly. I taped up a torn pad on its paw with what I had, some gauze, some duct tape, and a wire splint fashioned out of a coat hanger when I thought its wrist might be broken. Whoever this thing used its hands, it knew how to curl its tiny fingers around a spoon. It learned to hold the ladle on its own before the week was out. The first night was full of small miracles. It put itself to my chest and slept with the same breathing pattern as a child. When I got up to check on it, there was a neat pile of hair on the blanket where it had rubbed itself, like the shedding of a coat. I don't believe in signs, but I do believe in moments where the universe hands you a decision and watches. I set a record on the old console, Carole King, nothing fancy, the tone warm and human, and it cocked its head to the music as if it had been waiting for that exact note all its life. For 2 hours we sat with the record playing. This tiny, odd creature reached for the rim of the turntable with clumsy fingers and made the needle skip. I laughed, the sound loud in the little cabin. It gave a soft sound in return, the closest thing to a delighted gasp. You name the things you save because otherwise they become a litany. I called it Little Bit because that's what it was, a little bit of something without a category. The name stuck the way names do, softly and with a weighty logic. Little Bit learned to say my name within a week. Patrick, stretched and slow, like someone tasting a new word. The first week was a string of practical miracles. Little Bit ate canned chicken, scrubbed at by a small hand that already knew the rhythm of a human flannel. It learned to blow on hot porridge, it learned where the spoon should go in a bowl, and it learned that the wood stove was dangerous and the stovepipe hotter. I built a small pen in the corner of the room with an old apple crate and an extra rug. It's funny, when you have a creature that doesn't belong, you get very creative with what counts as a nursery. Neighbors canvassed the roads that week. There were always rumors of animals: wolves, a mountain lion sighted near the river, an old hound hit on the county 2 years back. I gave them all tight smiles and stories that wandered. Secrets in a small town are a kind of currency. You spend them sparingly. I didn't tell Sarah, not then. There was no easy way to explain a small thicket of hair in my hands and a heart that felt pulled toward it. 2 weeks is both a long time and nothing at all. In those days we slow the world. Feed, check, warm, teach, sleep. Little Bit learned to respond to my small rituals. It liked the feel of the CB in my hand and the scratch of the Morse code key I had in the shop.
Once, when I was fixing a radio, it sat beside the bench and watched the dial with a concentration that left me wondering what its ancestors had known about sound and signal. When I'd whistle a line of something I used to sing in high school, an old gospel mumble, it would tilt its head and make the same little sound I first heard on the highway. There were practical problems. A small creature raises larger legal issues. I called the state game warden when I couldn't avoid it, but he was 2 towns away and full of protocols and license forms that didn't have the right boxes for whatever this was. "Bring it in for a look," he told me. "If it's domesticated—" He didn't finish. I could hear the coffee in the background of his office and a clock that measured bureaucracy in slow ticks. I couldn't bring it in. I didn't have to fully explain why. The cabin was small. I knew how it took a town to change. I knew Sarah's patience and the sharpness of a sheriff's question. I wasn't sure what a paper trail would mean for this thing with 2 big hands. So I did the only sane and insane thing there is. I nursed it, and when the frost eased and the track softened, I carried it back into the thick of the pines. The morning I took Little Bit into the woods, the snow had hairlines of green where the sun had been. I held it close while the wind played the world into a hush. And when I set it down, it did not run. It lingered at the ragged edge, ears perking toward the crack of a distant twig. I felt like leaving a child at a train station and hoping for the best. Before I went back to the truck, Little Bit climbed into my coat and with both hands on my forearm wrapped itself up like a little animal knot. It put its forehead against my wrist and made that sound again, soft like a throat clearing. And then, for the first time, it put its small face up to mine and produced a long, careful sound that I didn't understand until it let loose a word that made my throat go tight. "Home," it said, somewhere between a wish and a promise. That was the end of the first chapter. I drove home to the cabin alone, the heater on, the radio a thin paper of noise. My hands were clean from snow and grease, but my heart carried a weight that wouldn't be easily shrugged off. Over the years, I learned that some things don't go away because you want them to. They stay because you carry them. I married Sarah in the summer 2 years later, on the bank of a meandering creek where the water moved like a ribbon. She was practical, bright-eyed, a nurse by temperament, and stubborn by trade. Her laugh had an easy bell to it, the kind that made people breathe out. We painted the kitchen cabinets blue and bought a Chevy C10 together. Mine had been a cheap rescue. Now it became ours. Emma came in the spring 3 years after that, 10 fingers and a mouth that took to laughter like a duck to water. Jake followed 2 summers later, blond and quick as an updraft. The house filled with small sounds. A baby monitor's static, the clink of enamel pans, the slap of mittens on a porch. I liked the ordinariness of it. The radio shop kept me busy. There was a steady clientele who preferred things wired and fixed to the idea of replacing. I liked the rhythm. Yet, in the quiet of the night, I could still hear little bit in the back of everything. Maybe it was nothing more than a memory that wore the shape of fingers, or a curious sense that the world had leaned slightly to one side and would never right itself. Sometimes I'd wake and picture a small face under a snowdrift, or the way a little hand had learned to take a spoon. Once, driving home from a job in Bitterroot, I thought I saw a shape at the tree line watching my truck. I slowed, heart picking up a private gate. It was a deer. It was wind-blown branches. Yet some ember of caution had been smoldering since 1974. There are things you can't unsee once you've chosen to be a rescuer. I kept odd habits. I left a small stack of canned goods in the back of the shed with an old note, "For animals, in case," and a thermos. The kids, when they were old enough to walk the yard, found the thermos and thought it a game. I never told them why I'd started the habit, and Sarah never asked. She trusted me, mostly. Trust in marriage is complicated in a small town built on old silences and the understanding that not all of life needs an explaining. One evening, an aftertaste of late summer, when cicadas were starting their ache and Emma was learning to ride without training wheels, I heard a sound outside that wasn't wind. It was deliberate, a gentle cracking that made the porch boards sing. I opened the door, expecting Dale Morrison, my neighbor, to be leaning on the railing with a beer and a question about fence posts. Instead, nothing, but a track, the kind a bear leaves if it's confused about fences. There were other small things. A carved mark on a post, deep and weathered, an arc like a crescent with teeth. I told myself it was a moose, an elk, anything but the thought that tugged at the corners of sleep, that something had watched us for years. I kept my mouth shut for the simple reason that secrets are a kind of shelter, and also because some truths have to survive in the right order. I had promised a life of safety to a creature that had once depended on me. Promises are stubborn. They don't understand what is convenient. There were times, over those 2 decades, when I told myself the right thing would have been to make the call, to put the creature into some state custody, to let the science proceed. There were times I'd run the scenarios, agents with clipboards, a small cage, a photograph on a newsprint, and the image of whatever little bits kind might be, caged and poked at, would clamp my gut. It frightened me to think of curiosity turned into cruelty. So I stayed quiet. I stayed practical. I stayed in my lane. Family, radio shop, firewood, supper. Sarah noticed I was quieter than most men would be. She had a way of seeing small inclines in expression and calling them out. Once, years in, she cornered me on the porch and demanded to know what had happened on Stanton Creek. I deflected. She pressed until I told a version of the story that made me sound reckless but not insane. An injured dog I brought home and released. She accepted that. I think she believed the shape of my story more than my words. If there's a grammar to secrets, it involves leaving room for mercy. I left room. I carried the secret like a prayer in my pocket. Little Bit was a closed chapter, I told myself. The winter had been a long time ago. The world had changed in ways you could see and in ways you couldn't. And so I watched the seasons commit to their rituals. I watched Emma learn to braid hair, watched Jake split his thumb on a whittling mishap and come home with an apology and a bandage. I fixed radios and servers, the latter metaphorically only. The latter didn't exist in the form they'd take later. 1994 was not a world of palm-sized computers. It was AM broadcasts, CB lingo, a town where Sheriff Anderson knew where everybody's kids had been. We kept our small town's rhythms, and I kept my watchful habit. Years folded into their own kinds of grief. My father died and left me his favorite wrench and a stoop of stories. I kept his wrench in the toolbox by the bench. I told the children that their grandfather had loved the little things in the world that weren't anyone's yet: empty jars, old keys, the patina of a radio dial. And they believed me. I told Sarah, often, that the world needs its unspectacular safe houses. She never pressed me on what those houses might shelter. It was in the winter of 1994-1995, 20 years after that first whiteout, that the world bent back the other way. I remember the day because the light was wrong, a late November that felt like a hinge between seasons, sky the brittle color of old glass. The kids were older. Emma had questions about college and the way you held a savings account. Jake had a skateboard that made him too proud for his own good. Sarah was working the night shift at the clinic. I had a late call to a repeater up on a ridge and came home with my hands smelling of grease and static. The house was a drawer of warmth. I turned the key, and the world breathed inside me. Then came the knock. It was 3 blows, heavy as a timber and precise as a metronome. Not the slow, tentative knocking of a neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar, not the awkward rapping of solicitors. It was deliberate. Old barns make knocks in the wind. This had intent. I froze, hand on the knob, the muscles of years adjusting to a different tension. My first thought was a prank. My second was Dale. Dale could be a heavy foot. My third thought was the one that always surprised me in the worst of ways. Little Bit. I stood with the doorknob under my palm and listened.
The knock came again, full and patient. Then a pause long enough for me to count my own heartbeats. It was not human-sized. It wasn't the kind of knock any of us had practiced in polite company. It landed as if someone with a large palm had chosen the center of our world to announce itself. I remember the way the hinges sighed when I opened the door. The porch light painted a strip of yellow over fresh snow. There, framed in that rectangle, was a silhouette that made the air go thin. It was not a man. It was tall enough that the porch light fell across its shoulders like a cloak. Its hair, if you could call it that, fell in shaggy lengths. Its arms were long, hands knuckled and old in places, but when it shifted, they moved with a kind of quiet, careful politeness, like any person who knows where their body starts and the world ends. It smelled of cedar and damp earth and a faint, clean musk I couldn't place at first. Then its head tipped. The face wasn't a mask. It was a face with forehead, eyes, a mouth that had learned to soften into curiosity. In the light, its eyes were not the empty, mythic thing I had been raised on by campfire stories. They were a human shade of tired, with a discipline in them like someone who had learned to live in too many winters. It spoke before I could. Not a roar, not a howl, just a sound that had a gravel and a childlike clear note, both. The language was not English at first. It was a cadence I recognized from watching children learn speech. Then a phrase landed in that accent like bricks set in mortar. Patrick, it said, slow and careful, the name rolling on a tongue that had practiced the sound. Friend. For an instant, the world narrowed to the two of us and a porch light. My mouth went dry. Above the hum of the refrigerator inside, somewhere in the house, the sound of children's laughter and a radio playing the soft edges of a song. I thought of the thermos I'd left under the shed eaves, of the little stack of canned goods I didn't expect to use. I thought of the promise I'd made in a different snow to a much smaller thing. "Are you—" I started, the sentence evaporating. I had been a man who kept secrets. I had been a man who told himself he had been practical. I had been many things. But standing there, the decades collapsed into a particular decision. You either open the door for what is at your threshold, or you shut the house and pretend you never heard it. The creature, if creature were the right word, lifted its hand in a gesture that felt almost like a bow.
Fur threaded between its fingers. The knuckles were thick. It showed me its palm like a human might show a paper that proves something. On the skin or the hair there was a pattern of scars, thin and old, like the stitches of a life. "Little bit," I said, a question and an exhale and everything else stacked together. The taller one inclined its head, and then from the shadow behind it a smaller shape shifted. A woman, I thought at first, but her face bore a wide, soft beauty, and she had a baby on her shoulder. The baby made a small noise like a reed flute. The sight of the infant made my chest drop away and then fill with something fierce and mortal. Out of the corner of the dark, another figure rose, slower and steadier. The three of them filled the doorway like a coming of a different country. The taller one, Little Bit, grown beyond any measure I had, spoke again, broken English folded like cloth around meaning. "Friend Patrick," Little Bit said, one word at a time, patience like a craft. "We have home question, old one sick, need roof, ask." It wasn't a plea so much as a ledger opened to me. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. We had once been given shelter, now we asked to repay the debt. 20 years was a long time to carry a small favor like a stone in your pocket, but here it was, a request larger than my house. I stood on the threshold with nothing between us but night and a porch. Behind me, the house hummed with familiars, the stove, the refrigerator, the beat of life that anchored me. Ahead of me, the night smelled like the forest and something older. I thought of the thermos, of the apple crate that had been a nursery, of the small rituals that had kept me honest. I thought of Sarah, working a night shift a mile away, likely to come home at dawn and find her life tipped into story. I thought of my children and the neatness of their rooms, the sketches on the fridge. I thought of the promise I'd once made in a whiteout. In the end, it was a man in the door and the thing he held between his hands that decided the shape of the moment. Little Bit's shoulders were broad. He could have stepped in and assumed command, demanded hospitality like a lord. He did not. His posture was that of someone who had learned to ask. "How long?" I started. It was a question that wasn't about time. How long have you been since?" Little Bit's eyes blackened in a way I read then as a kind of sorrow and a fierce, awkward affection. He tapped his chest with a trembling hand and then reached up and took his own wrist where the old scars ran like riverbeds, then pointed to me and touched his lips with 2 fingers. 20, he said, slow. 20. You left. Little Bit. The word left my mouth like the rustle of leaves. You survived. Little Bit stiffened, then made a small sound that might have been the closest thing to laughter his people had learned. We good, he said, and added, in a voice that had learned to smooth its jagged edges into something like a promise, we ask shelter for old one, morning, baby reed, winter bad, snow long. The names landed like pebbles in my palm. Elder ash, morning, reed. Each one a story, each one a burden and a blessing. I remember the way the porch light made their hair glint like river mud. I remember the small jingling sound of something like a charm at Little Bit's neck, a carved token of wood. I remember the tilt of the baby, the way Morning held Reed against her shoulder with both hands, the way the infant's head nuzzled into hair like a bird finding a nest. Can I asked, because there was 1,000 practical questions behind one opening offer. Can you come in? Sit, warm up. Little Bit's head tipped as if the offer were too generous, like an old habit of the wild not meant for thresholds. He understood needing to be polite in the world of houses, and yet the idea of entry was foreign. Respect, he said. The word meant to cover 100 rules I didn't yet know. We ask quiet, keep secret, for safety. I understood the cadence of bargains. In the county, a man doesn't make deals he can't keep.
My mind began 3 steps ahead. The shed, blankets, spare canned goods, the thermos. A practical list for an impractical moment. My heartbeat moved into a stretch I recognized. Part fear, part calculation, part something else that had neither name nor category. "Okay," I said. "Okay, come in." They crossed the porch like men stepping through a stream, careful, respecting the threshold. Little Bit ducked his head. He moved with a grace I had not imagined in a being his size, a remembrance of forest that put me to shame in my clumsy city gait. Morning came next, the infant snug at her shoulder in a makeshift sling of cloth. The elder, Elder Ash, I later learned the name, followed with a slow, dignified step, cane tapping the boards like punctuation. They filled my kitchen like a panorama of a world I'd once held in my hand. The stove breathed and warmed the air. The old braided rug underfoot softened their step. Sarah, still at the clinic, was not there. The kids were away at a neighbor's for the night. Fortunate permissions, tiny roomings that later felt like mercies. Little Bit settled by the stove like he'd once lived there. Morning sat on a chair as if she knew how chairs worked. Elder Ash leaned against the counter and closed a hand around a mug of coffee I poured for her, even though she didn't know the ritual. She made a small sound that might have been blessing. She smiled with lips that had seen a century of winters. We sat around like a terrible, breath-held family. Little Bit spoke haltingly, and I translated in my head as much as I did aloud. It was not fluency, it was barter. He used words he had learned, picking them like berries, and sometimes bringing back the seed. "Children, your children," Little Bit said finally, eyes flicking toward the back door. "Safe?" "Safe," I answered. "Thank you," Little Bit said. For a being with an old face, his gratitude carried a child's honesty. We remember, we keep debt. It was more than an admission, it was a claim to history.
The world in that kitchen, under the hum of a fridge and the soft tick of a clock, felt like a ledger opened and read. 20 years was not merely an interval, it was an accumulation of things done and undone. When Sarah came home at first light, rubbing sleep from her eyes, she found us around the table like visitors to a foreign custom, and for a moment the world held its breath. Her face moved in that splendid human sequence of confusion, anger, accusation, and then something softer when she saw the old woman's fingers, when she watched Little Bit touch the braided rug like a benediction. She asked questions that a woman with a nurse's mind and a mother's instinct might ask. Where did they come from? Who would believe? How long could we keep them? The practical third of her mind surfaced like surf. The part of her that had helped birth our children into the world looked at Morning's baby like a fellow parent and adjusted, fast, sharp, miraculous. "You can't keep them here," Sarah said at last, with that stubborn practicality that had kept our marriage honest. "You haven't thought this through, Patrick." I made the mistake of being truthful. 20 years, I said. They asked. She exhaled, not innocent or cruel, but as if measuring the weight of what it means to say yes. "We don't have room for secrets," she said. "We don't have room for danger. What if someone finds them? What if Sheriff Anderson hears?" "We'll keep them in the shed," I said. My voice felt far away. "We'll keep them quiet. Thermos, blankets. They won't bring trouble." "Not our children," she said, the words clean as glass. "Not our kids." We argued with the sort of love that is its own territory, 1 foot in the shelter of family, 1 foot on the side of the world that demands mercy. Sarah shuttled between indignation and a practical calculation I had learned to respect. I watched her as she watched Morning hold Reed as a mother does, without ceremony and with a ferocity I'm ashamed to say surprised me. In the end, it was not a vote so much as a slow, acquiescing kindness. Sarah folded her hands, looked at the elder's face, saw the years there, and imagined in a single gesture every person she had ever held under a hospital light. She was trained in the registry of wounds and the soft ache of body and soul. She paused and then reached out, brushed Elder Ash's knuckles with a tenderness that was ordinary and perfect all at once. "Enough," she said to me finally, and then to the room. "We'll keep them, but no one else. No one." The bargain was made like that, soft and immediate and absolute. We turned our shed into a sanctuary, lumber stacked against the walls, a battery lamp hung from the beam, a straw mattress laid down, and a heating stove jury-rigged with a pipe through a hole I'd insulate badly, but with love. I stocked it with canned goods and a bucket for water. We mapped out routes and marked caches, food hidden in places only an old man with a map would think to hide. Little Bit watched the preparations with a gravity that made a small thing feel very large. At night, after they had settled and the shed's little window glowed like a secret coin in the black, I sat on the porch with my coffee and thought about the world. I thought of the winter that had happened 2 decades ago and of how small decisions create long threads. I thought about how Little Bit's hand had felt in mine and how my life had folded itself around that moment like paper around a gift. The house was quieter than it had been in years. No children's stomps, no Sarah's late shift shifting into sleep. The radio in the den hummed with static and the faint voice of a DJ waxing on the weather. I listened to it and felt the weight of a story settling in my throat. This was not bragging or a claim. It was a ledger of compassion, and the world was going to test whether we could keep our promise. I do not know when fear became a companion to wonder, but it sat at the table with us now. The thought of Sheriff Anderson's practical eyes and clipboards, of neighbors gossiping and pointing, of newspapers with grainy photos, the possibilities circulated like cold gusts. Still, there was, in the quiet, something so utterly human and undeniable about the way the little family in the shed slept and breathed and cooed over Reed that my misgivings seemed like thin ice. Days turned into a pattern. I fixed radios in the morning, Sarah did the nights, and in the gray afternoons we'd check on the shed and bring supplies. Little Bit learned where the canned peaches were. Morning learned the rhythm of a kitchen and how a child's laugh sounds in a human house. Elder Ash, the elder's name, I understood later, was a title, told stories in a language that drummed with the cadence of old forests. There were words she used that had edges of Gaelic and other older tongues I couldn't place. When she spoke of the mountains, her voice would fold inward and the air around us would seem to grow older by degrees. We kept our promise, in the way people keep good intentions, with small daily acts that added up into shelter. I did not tell the town. I told only 2 people, people who would not betray the private edges of mercy, and even that felt like too much. The secret of the shed grew like a small library of hushes in my life. But I began to notice that someone in the woods watched us differently now. The raw tracks of animals in a new pattern. A bundle of sticks that spoke of a path made by deliberate feet. Once, a deer stood in a clearing and watched our house with an intent that had nothing to do with almonds or salt licks. I told myself the tracks were coyotes and chance, but nights, the memory of the knocks would return and sit like a hand on my shoulder. The winter settled heavy that year. The kind that teaches you the difference between what you can control and what you cannot. We cut more wood than I thought any household might need. We rationed. We tucked blankets into corners and learned the curvature of 3 sleeping forms in the shed. There was comfort, too. Morning would bring us a twig of spruce and lay it on the windowsill like a blessing. Little Bit would sit and hum something that sounded like a child's tune, and sometimes, with a precision that still startles me when I think of it, he'd run a finger over the Hollis amplifier as if he knew what the dials meant. He learned to wipe a plate. He learned, after watching Emma braid a ribbon, how to make a rudimentary braid of his own hair. Sometimes, when the heater ticked and the world shrank to the measure of a house and a radio, I'd flip on an old Carole King record and the music would spill over the room like sunlight, smoothing the edges of everything. Little Bit would tap the distance of the melody, as if remembering who had taught him that small human joy in a lifetime ago. He called it Soft Place, and every time he said that, I felt the old miracle burn like the slow end of a match. There were disagreements, of course. There are always moments where ethics and fear and love come together into a knot. Sarah would say sharply, "No one knows, not yet." I would answer, "We owe them," and she'd cut me off, the shape of her face folding into something that looked, in that light, like mercy and terror mixed. We owe our children safety too. I didn't have an answer that resolved everything. We lived off the uneasy axis of the right thing and the brave thing, and sometimes those two don't have the same map. But slowly, because Sarah was, beneath her practicality, a woman who finds pivots where other people see walls, she came to see that the work of being human is often messy and impossible, and still worth more than the sum of our nervousness. She made a baby blanket for Reed from an old sweater. She stacked canned peaches in the shed in neat rows. She hummed lullabies I'd never heard, and once, with a voice that would have made my mother proud, she mended a toy with a needle and thread and a practicality like worship. On a night when the snow lay heavy and the stars were diminished to a few tired candles, Little Bit crept up to the porch and knocked twice, gently, such that I nearly missed it. He placed in my hand a carved figurine, no larger than my palm. It was of a figure with exaggerated hands and a face with simple eyes. The carving was crude, but unambiguous. I understood it in my bones as a token. "Thank you," he said. "Remember." I keep that figurine now on the bench where I work radios. It is small, but when I polish the case of a tube and look at the wood, I feel the weight of that winter press again, a tenderness that is both heavy and freeing. Then, one night when the snow drifted in odd, secretive shapes and the radio complained of static, the world changed. The knock at the door that had once been a rumor returned as intent. Not the small hand of a child this time, not a trick of branch against the roof. It was a striking, deliberate thunder of 3 blows that I felt in the soles of my boots. My heart went to the place where the past and future met, and I knew, with a certainty that made me feel like a man willing the sky not to fall, that what had begun in a whiteout 20 years earlier was coming home to collect its due. The rest, how we would shield them, how we would plan a route north, how Sheriff Anderson and Dale would factor into the ledger, those were the things that would stretch out across the winter and shape the rest of our lives. That night, standing with my hand on the doorknob under a porch light that made everything a little too honest, I felt the old decision, save or not, open like a book. Whatever came after would require more than a thermos and canned peaches. It would require the kind of courage that doesn't always announce itself with trumpets, the kind that's only apparent in the small, stubborn ways people keep promises. I turned the knob. The cold outside smelled like pine and a promise. The rest waited on the threshold with the rhythm of 3 knocks and the weight of something once small that had grown to be larger than any of us had imagined. If you like true feeling, stranger than fiction stories, stick with me. This one gets stranger yet. We let them in. They moved through the house with a mixture of ceremony and fatigue. Little Bit walked like a man who had finally closed a long journey and found his feet on a known floor. Morning sat at the kitchen table and propped Reed on a folded towel while she unwrapped the baby's mittened hands and hummed the same low song she seemed to carry everywhere. Elder Ash eased herself onto one of the kitchen chairs as if it were a throne. Her fingers, knuckled and spotted with age, found the rim of a mug and held it like a treasure. We agreed the shed was the only sensible place. It had a loft for storage, a small workbench where I kept an old battery lantern, and a side door that led out to the back lane. It wasn't ideal. No house is when secrecy's the price of mercy. But it was shelter,
And for the winter that now wrapped itself around us, shelter was everything. Secret, Little Bit said again, the word rounded and careful between his teeth. He tapped the table once, as if stamping a contract. No talk, no lights rode, night go. He broke his sentences down the way he always did. Economy of syllables, each one earned. Okay, I told him. No lights, no visitors. We'll keep them there. We'll check in every day. He looked at me and then, briefly, at Sarah. There was a resolution in his face that had no need to prove itself. He added, "We pay you with, we give story. We give thanks." He lifted a hand and pressed it flat over his chest. Debt, the word he preferred. Old debt. We set to work that very night. Sarah and I turned the old shed into a furtive kind of nursery. I hauled straw bales into the loft, sealed a draft under the door with a strip of rubber I pried from a junk pile, and bowed my pride into duct tape and good intentions. Sarah lined a corner with blankets and stacked cans in a neat wall, the kind only the practical can make look like art. We brought in a small portable heater, enough to take the edge off, not so much to invite curious noses, and strung a battery lamp where it would not be visible from the lane. I drilled a small hole for a stovepipe and left the insulation rough. It smelled of burnt sawdust the first time we lit it, and we laughed at that clumsy little mistake, like people who make mistakes and then keep making promises anyway. Little Bit supervised as if he were a contractor sent by a council of mercy. He watched how the generator's cord wrapped and how the wood stacked. When morning tucked a blanket around Reed, his voice softened. "Reed," he said, pronouncing the baby's name as if testing the sound on his own tongue. "Good name. Sound like river." He'd learned names the way a man learns a trade, by repetition and careful attention. His English was deliberate, and I kept a habit of repeating what he said back to him, partly so I could understand, and partly because the act of translating made the moment feel less like trespass and more like exchange. Elder Ash mostly observed. She listened to the radiator's little noises and smiled at small domestic things as if they were glimpses from a book she once read. Once, when Sarah brought her a bowl of soup, Elder Ash closed her eyes and placed her hand over her belly in a gesture that seemed to cross species and language, gratitude. Little Bit sat across from me on the old crate in the shed the next afternoon and unfolded, in the spare way he had, the outline of his people's present. He tapped a map I'd laid out, topographical, inked with contour lines and the kind of hatches that mean steep country, and traced with a calloused finger a route north. "We small," he said. "People small. Woods gone. Wolves worse. Hunting less. Old ones fall. Need place, not road. Canada north. River big. Pass over. Night move." I felt my chest tighten. The map suddenly looked fragile. He was precise in his necessities. "How many can fit?" I asked. "3 now, maybe one more, if way clear," he answered. "Elder Ash cannot go far. Morning carry baby. Little Bit guide. We leave at moon dark." He folded his hands like a man asking for a borrowing and not a favor, like a ledger with respect on both sides. I gave him a list of caches I knew up the valley, hidden alcoves in rock, a hollow under an old beaver dam, places I'd used in the past to hold extra gas or a bag of salt when errands went wrong. He looked at my fingers as I showed him topographic folds, and for a moment I felt the ridiculous intimacy of teaching a creature how to read a map. He learned quick. He asked about rivers that ran under the snow, about roads that saw little traffic, about which nights the sheriff would be on patrol, and which nights a man like Dale would drive his truck with a tailgate full of lumber. We practiced. It sounds foolish to say we practiced like people practicing a cheer, but we did. Little Bit creased the map into small squares, wrapping his finger like a ring around places he thought could shelter tracks. He asked about the back roads I used when a job required discretion, and about the old ranger trail that angled through a stand of dead firs the county never bothered to plow. I told him what I knew. He nodded as if receiving a prayer.
The days settled into an oddly gentle rhythm. During daylight, we moved like people carrying a soft secret. I to the shop, Sarah to the clinic, and briefing visits to the shed with canned goods and a borrowed bassinet Sarah insisted on making sturdier. At night, I walked lines with Littlebit and laid down caches of food. Occasionally, when the moon was young and the snow bluing under it, Littlebit would come to the porch and sit with me and hum. It was a low sound, like a rock rolled over small pebble, and old music. Once I tried to hum back. He clapped once, the way someone applauds a first recital, and said, "Soft place," the phrase we'd used before for music and for the hearth. It became, in our tiny lexicon, a shorthand for home. Elder Ash's stories were what I came for when the nights had teeth. They came slow and like river talk, round, patient, and always with a sense of time as a braid. Sometimes they were told in her own language and relayed by Littlebit. Sometimes she used a few English words she prized. She spoke of mountains when they were full of their own voices, and of a time when her people kept to the creek beds and traded for husks of corn and for the human kindness that came in the form of left-behind bread. She spoke of a time when a logging road cleaved a ridge and a whole valley woke up with its edges missing. She did not rail, she chronicled. One night, as the wind rode itself across the shed roof, she told a story that cut through me and made me feel exactly where I stood in the ledger of things. It was once, she said, Littlebit translating the cadence, and I wrote the words down later in a notebook that smells of cedar, when my mother was young. We walked the ridges with hands like winter. There was a place of hot stones and steam, we call it breath. My people would go there to remember the summer. We would sit and name the stars like leaves. Once a boy lost his way in breath. Snow hid him, and his small foot broke. We could not carry him, so we wait. He waited, until a man with a radio on a ridge heard a sound like a bell and came and found him. The man brought blankets. He gave his coat. He did not ask to keep the boy. He left and never told the world. Our people remember that man. She paused, and the shed listened. In her hands, the story felt like an old coin placed in the palm of the present. When my son came back, she finished, in the voice that was more granite than apology, we fed the man with tea at our fire. We cut him a figure, and we left it by his door. We call him friend. Littlebit put his hand over his heart and said, "We remember the kindness." It was a small story. It functioned in the economy of our secret like a coin. It made us feel honest. Another night she told of Reed's name. It was not simply a name, she explained, but a remnant of a line of small things that sustained her people. Reed be song, Littlebit translated. Reed bend and sing in water. When we move, we name little ones for how river moves, so they not forget to be light. Morning, who had learned the softness of human hands, looked at Reed and let out a laugh that could have been a sob and a prayer at the same time. Elder Ash's stories became lessons. They taught me, in their gentle way, the shape of a long survival. How you hold a small people together when the world eats what you depend on. How you measure loss in songs, not funerals. How you give thanks when someone else saves a child in a storm. And they gave the shed an atmosphere that was neither human nor wholly wild. A place of exchange where we both taught and were taught. As Christmas approached, the town hummed with ordinary lights. We kept ours low. No tree was set by the window to invite gossip. Sarah sewed a small sweater for Reed from an old flannel shirt of mine. The stitches were tidy and wrong-sized, but perfect in the way stitchwork often is when done by someone thinking of small hands. We left an extra casserole in the oven and then cooled it on the stove and took a lid of it to the shed. The smell of rosemary and browned bread traveled through the wood like a benediction. But the world that had slid into our hands was a precarious thing. It had edges that cut. Elder Ash's breathing became shallow in late January. It was quiet at first, a small hitch when she moved, a longer nap. Littlebit noticed before anyone else. He came in from the shed one twilight and stood on the porch, his face rearranged by worry. "Old one, rest," he said. And then, with a child's clarity, "Pain. Need water. Need river story." We did what we could. Sarah used her nurse's practice to make Elder Ash comfortable. Warm compresses, a measured broth, the soft rub of a hand across knuckles. We built a small cradle for her outside the shed door, with blankets, and left a bowl of clean water from the spring I trusted. Little Bit and Morning kept vigil in shifts, humming a song that sounded like distant bells. The night Elder Ash died is the kind of night that ages a man in a single hour. A low snow fell. The world was a soft black that accepted any sound and made it heavier. Reed slept in a sling at Morning's chest like a small blind question. Little Bit sat beside Elder Ash and pressed that carved wooden charm he wore against her palm. "Story," Elder Ash whispered, and Little Bit translated slowly. "Tell story of our people to the house people, so we not vanish like print on water." So we told stories. We told them the small ones Elder Ash loved. The tale of the mountain that once moved like a beast, of a child who learned to whistle like a hawk and thus survived a storm, of an elder who planted a seed that later became a grove. Little Bit's voice flickered between languages, and sometimes he didn't translate at all, but instead let us listen to the cadence of a tongue older than our clocks. Sarah sat with her hand on Morning's and stroked Reed's hair with the care of a midwife. I listened and realized my chest had rooms I had never known were there. When Elder Ash let go, she did so like someone closing a book she'd read 1,000 times. There was no grand moment of epiphany, just a quiet that rolled across the shed like a tidal breath. Little Bit sobbed once, a sound that was both a child's and an ancient animal's. Morning pressed her head to the elder's hand and let out a soft keening. We wrapped her in a blanket that smelled of pine and old cloth and carried her into the night. They buried Elder Ash with what care I would give a father, no more and no less. We dug in a stand of fir beneath a slope where the ground held warmth in the roots, and Little Bit spoke words in his language that I didn't understand, but that had the timbre of benediction. In the morning, before the snow melted, a small cairn of stones marked the place. Little Bit carved a mark into the top stone, an arc with teeth, the same crescent I'd once seen on a post, and pressed his thumb into the snow. "Remember," he said, simply. After Elder Ash's death, the shed felt both emptier and more alive. She had been the memory keeper, and without her, the stories flowed through others like a river rerouted. Little Bit took on an elder's stoop prematurely, but not in a way that diminished him. He grew into a steadier frame, a man with a child's mercy and an adult's calculation. Morning's eyes were both bright and raw, protected by the fierce calculation of a mother. Reed, never more than 14 months, was a small heat that stitched us together. The tension that would change everything came, as it always does, from a human angle. Dale Morrison. Dale was the kind of neighbor who meant well even when he meant poorly. He was big in a way townspeople admire, broad shoulders, a laugh like a saw, and he'd been in and out of my life for years. He came by one morning, ostensibly to borrow a wrench or confirm a pickup, but what he did was more mundane. He noticed that the back lane had a new string of footprints. They were large and widely spaced, a gait that didn't belong to elk or bear. He cross-referenced them with the days he'd parked his truck there the last week and realized with the surprising clarity that comes from a man with nothing better to do that something had changed. Dale followed the prints. He was not malicious, he was merely curious. He edged close to the shed and, in the bright gray light of a late morning, saw a small hand disappear behind a plank. He peered through a gap and saw Morning tending a small child. If you've ever been the kind of person who sees something you don't expect, you know how the mind goes to the nearest explanation. Dale's mind did not fly toward wonder. It went toward alarm. He saw hair and a sling and hands that were too broad. He clattered away and dialed the sheriff. When Sheriff Anderson arrived, the town held its breath in the way towns do, which is to say, it changed its rhythm to match rumor. He was a man with a clipboard and a practiced face, the kind that had no stranger emotion when confronted with oddities. He regarded oddities like weather patterns, curious but to be recorded. I answered his first questions on the porch. He looked between my hands and the yard and asked me if I'd had any strangers. I told him I had a family business with my own oddities, old radios, an old truck, and a habit of doing my errands at odd hours. Dale's story, when he told it, came out breathless and honest. "Patrick, you gotta look. I think someone's been living in that shed. I saw—" He stopped himself as if the image of a baby in a mother's sling had lodged in his throat. He told a version that was more frantic than accusatory. He wanted answers. He wanted to be the one who had them. He wanted to be the right one, the one with the solution. Sheriff Anderson listened. He is a practical man, and he arranged things like a man who believes in paperwork more than fate. "We should have a look," he said, and his voice held the kind of leveled assumption that people make when they think the right thing is evidence. He put a deputy with a dog on a pickup and suggested, politely, that I come along. I let him go, because there are times when saying no creates consequences you don't want. I was in the shed when they came to look. Morning had just tucked Reed into a bundle, and Littlebit was at the back, arranging wood. When I heard the truck, I felt the wind change like a human-held breath. Littlebit looked at me, and then, with a clarity that made my gut hollow, mouthed, "Night move." There was a small window between daylight and something more dangerous. We had to leave before anyone could come rummaging through our lives with a notepad and a certainty that their certainty was better than mine. Panic moves through people in different tempos. Sarah's asked questions fast and fought feeling with logic. Mine tended to slow and arrange a map. Littlebit's moved in a low, focused string of commands. We had, at most, an hour if we were prudent.
"Get Reed," Littlebit said, and in his voice was the ferocity of a man who knows what birthright looks like. "No lights. The road to old logging, then north. River dark. We move when truck quiet." I filled my arms with cash packs, canned goods, a thermos full of coffee, a small duffel of clothes, while Sarah pulled from her closet the one thing that would make the difference, a baby carrier she'd made from an old canvas rucksack. She knelt with Morning and fashioned it with a practiced hand into a sling that could hold Reed close and shield him from the wind. Morning's face was a cross of gratitude and fear. She trusted Sarah in a way that cuts through the rest of a life. We packed in the shed like people moving out of a postcard. Littlebit stacked items with an economy that surprised me. He folded shirts like they were a currency and placed a carved charm on top of each bundle. He left a small figurine on the workbench, an offering, I think, as much to us as to the road. Outside, Dale had called his brother, and in the course of a quarter hour, the sheriff's truck rolled slowly past the lane and cut its headlights in a way that made my blood run to a different drum. We could not move with cars near. We had to make it to the old logging trail, a path I used in January when a job required discretion. It was narrow and rough, and the kind of place that holds snow in pockets. It was, in short, a route that suited a group that needed to disappear. We slipped out the side gate, the way men do when the world has turned into a test. Morning carried Reed under the cross of her arm. Littlebit and another, who I learned later was a cousin named Dawn, followed. I walked with them to the first ridge, my breath making ghosts in the dark, the maps tucked into my coat like a promise. Sarah stayed behind long enough to shut the back door and set the kitchen lights to a low bulb, as if to give the house a sleeping face. She reached me at the gate and took my hand, standing close enough that the heat of her palm burned like a blessing. "You come back," she said. No argument, no impossible curse or sermon, just a request for the thing that mattered. Return. Her eyes were damp, but the set of her jaw was iron. "We try," I said, not sure if I believed it. And then, because the world demands small ironies of us, I laughed once like a man who'd given up the safe scripts. We moved. The plan was meticulous in its modesty. We would travel at night, stay off main roads, cross at points where the river narrowed and the current favored those who knew the stones. I marked caches on the map, an overturned log with a tin tied under it at the bend where the old beaver pond kept a pocket of unfrozen water, a boulder with a carved notch we'd used years earlier as a waypoint. Little Bit learned the map as if he'd always known how to read paper. He memorized ridge lines and dipped his head when I counted the hours. He could feel weather in the way his shoulders held, and he warned us, once, of a whiteout that might come 2 nights hence. I listened because he had never been wrong about how snow holds a secret. We started in the dark. The sheriff's trucks cut down into the valley too late. Their headlights were an afterthought chewing at the tail of the darkness. We moved through a world that smelled of cold cedar and ancient stone. Reed's small face tucked against Morning's neck was a little human thing that hardened me in a way I did not enjoy. I thought of my own children, asleep under quilts, safe and not knowing the edges of the world their father had committed to. Crossing the river was a test. We picked our stones with childhood memory and with the understanding of those who had no telescopes and no engines to call for help. Little Bit moved with an ease I envied, feet sure where mine slid. Reed gave a single cry as the water's spray hit a cheek and then quieted. We reached the far bank like a man crawling out of a trapdoor, wet hands, shivering, and full of a fierce relief. Hours later, we were in a stand of firs that kept the wind at bay. We halted in the lee of a rock and let the night do whatever it would. Little Bit produced the small carved figure he'd left on my workbench and set it between us. He placed his palm upon it, then pressed it into the snow, as if to anchor the debt to earth again. "We go to pass at dawn," he said. "Road small by day. We walk slow. Sheriff, he will look, but he not find if tracks go old. They follow old roads, not trees." We tricked the tracks, an old trick I learned from trappers, a loop into a drainage and then back out 30 yards downstream, so that Prince told a false story to anyone who might have the patience to follow. It was nothing heroic, it was craft. It worked. We moved through nights and rested in the small crowns of the earth where snow spared a hollow. Morning sang at intervals to Reed. Little Bit paced the maps in his head. I felt as if I were part of a small caravan of strangers and family and a debt repaid. It was messy and honest and terrifying. There were moments of small rescue even in the flight. At one point, as dawn turned the sky to the thin color of old bone, we saw a man on a ridge ahead, a silhouette kneeling by an overturned sled. He had frozen liquid spread across the crust of snow, as if his motor had died and the cold had taken his warmth. Little Bit signaled and motioned. For a small, ridiculous second, I thought he'd gone to attack. Instead, he walked toward the man, giant hands careful, and offered him a strip of canvas and a small bark cup of broth. The man stared and then accepted, as if someone had offered him a bridge. We passed through a stretch of logging road at midday that stewarded us to the county line. The pace altered in me. The part of me that had known small certainties like bill payments and school plays felt residually guilty and incredibly proud.
Little Bit's plan, topographic knowledge, our caches, the timing of the sheriff's patrols, held like a net. By nightfall, we had only a day or two left to cross before we would be over the border. Little Bit and Morning planned to travel with the care of people who measure their movement by rivers instead of calculators. I wanted to go with them as far as I could, but the map had a line where my work was and their needs began. I played out scenarios in my head with a stubborn domesticity. If they cross there, then take the ridge by the old cairn, then the stones. My mind lit with small blueprints. I could not go past a certain point. My children needed a father still. Little Bit understood. He grasped my hands and said, "Friend, you home. We remember why you saved child. We carry." When they left at first light the next morning, Little Bit pressed his forehead to mine in a way that had no language but conveyed everything. Morning placed Reed against my chest, small fingers curling around my thumb. I did not know whether I would see them again. I said what men say in such moments, perhaps out of arrogance or hope. If you make it, send a sign. Little Bit smiled, the way someone smiles at a small joke between conspirators. We give gift, he said. When we safe, we bring thing. They moved off like a story folding itself shut, and I watched them disappear under a belt of fur until they were nothing but a darker line against the snow. The ache that followed was the memory of a wound being sewn without anesthesia. The sheriff came to the house the following afternoon. His truck rolled up with the polite clatter of a man doing his job, and he looked at me as if reading a familiar book. He asked pointed questions about lights, about nights I worked late, about whether I had seen anyone I would not expect. I answered in the way a man answers who has risked a kindness and paid the tax, sparsely, with the honesty of someone who will own the immediate consequence if it comes. Nobody found, I told him. Nothing here. He narrowed his eyes but left me with a tactful warning about being careful. The town settled, the way it has a mind to do. Gossip simmered, Dale grew quieter, and the sheriff kept his clipboard full of questions he had not yet asked. Weeks moved by like the slow turning of a weathered wheel. Snow melted and reformed. The radio shop hummed and the house smelt like bread at times. Life continued in these ordinary stitches, and I moved through them with one hand more careful than I'd been before. I kept my bench clear, and the carved figurine Little Bit had left on it clean. I ran my thumb across the wood in the evenings and tried to convince myself that the world had not folded too far. Then, in late spring, not more than a month past the time they'd left, a small package appeared on my back sill. It was wrapped in birch bark, tied with a strip of leather. On top lay a small carved figure, larger than the token Little Bit had left earlier, and beside it a strip of bark upon which images had been scratched, pictograms that said without letters what words might have mangled. The first showed a house and a man, and an arrow from the house to the north. The second showed a figure like Little Bit with a looped path and a river. The third showed a small cluster of stones and a tree. At the bottom, someone had left, in small, careful script, English, unmistakably human, the words, "Thank you, we remember." I held the bark up to the light and traced the pictograms like a child reading a magical alphabet. It told me what I had wanted to hear and what I had been afraid not to. They'd made it across the pass and found a place beyond the churn of roads and rumor. Reed's small pictogram had a curled line like a reed. Little Bit's icon had a marked wound on the wrist, the little scars he'd always shown but never explained. The carved figure smelt faintly of smoke and cedar. When I put the package on my bench, the house felt something like whole and something like emptied of a previous appointment. I placed the figurine next to the first one Little Bit had given me and felt as if I had become a keeper of a small tradition. The relief was a physical thing. It settled in my ribs and unbent the hours of that winter. We kept the token on the bench where my kids could not find it and where I could polish it with the rag I kept for radio knobs. I thought of Little Bit as a man-turned-legend in my life. I thought of Reed and mourning as proof that the world is capable of odd, fragile compassion. I thought about the ledger of favors that people forget or deliver without knowing, like a neighbor who shovels a walk without wanting credit. Months later, in a way that felt as inevitable as the river's turn, a note arrived. This time tucked under the windowsill and written in a hand that was rough but precise. A longer birch bark pictogram, and under it a small carved figurine with hands larger than the first. The pictogram showed a small household beyond a bend, 3 figures living under a shelter of pines, and a child, Reed, standing by a river. Beside it, in faint charcoal, a line that read, in the simplest English possible, "Elder no die. Breath left. Reed sleep. Morning sing. Little Bit keep watch." I held the bark against my chest and felt all the small mergers of the last year. The shed's warmth, Elder Ash's last story, Sarah's hands at morning stitches. The pictogram was not a boast, it was a gift. It was proof not of the wild spectacle, but of a survival that would not make headlines and didn't need to. One more small people making their way on a planet that too easily forgets how to hold anything that doesn't fit in a ledger. I don't tell the story as proof of anything more than the fact that mercy exists, and that sometimes it is repaid in ways larger than us. I tell it because there are things a man carries like a stone in his pocket. Sometimes you forget the weight until you hand it to someone else and find out that someone else is carrying theirs too. The carved figurines sit on my bench now, a pair that looks like two parts of a whole. When I work the knobs of a radio and the shop hums, I glance down and remember the first winter, the cold, the record, the little hand that curled round my thumb. I remember the 3 knocks on my door 20 years later and how a giant measured his voice into my threshold. I remember the brief, terrified sprint north and the way Sarah folded her hands and decided that sometimes family is bigger than the people who share your blood. I remember Elder Ash's stories, and I tell them now to my kids in a way that keeps the shape without revealing the secret. They listen with the gullible hunger of children who do not yet know which parts of the world will try to eat the rest. They think the stories are simply good fireside tales. Sometimes, when the north wind comes down off the bitterroots and the world rearranges itself into recognizable danger, I take the map out and trace the route Little Bit took, the ones I taught him, as if I were mentoring a man who might become a friend of my children. I tell myself that kindnesses stack like stones, and that one day Emma or Jake might find a small creature on the road and decide, as I did, to put it in the truck and bring it home. I think often about promises, how a small one made in a whiteout can fold a life into its own long story. I think about secrecy and about the friction between loving your family and keeping a pledge to a stranger in need. I think about the things we keep secret and the things we choose to share. On quiet evenings, I still hear the cadence of Little Bit's voice in the corners of the house. Now and then, when the light falls a certain way on the radio bench, I take down the little figurines and polish them with the same rag my father once used on his wrench. My fingers trace the carved hands, and I think of a baby in the snow and of a man who knocked on my door taller than any neighbor had a right to be. People ask if what I tell is true. I tell them it is my truth, the kind that sits like a weight and makes you better at doing small things. I tell them that in town we do sometimes find ways to be both ordinary and strange. I tell them that 20 years after I bent and warmed something so small it might have fit in the palm of my hand, something much larger came back to repay a debt. I tell them that we made a plan, that my family risked, that we navigated with maps and with courage, and that, in the end, a carved figurine marked their survival. If this story moves you, share it with someone who believes in small mercies, and tell us, what would you have done if that knock came at your door?